On September 7, 1862, Colonel Walter Taylor of General Robert E. Lee's staff wrote to his sister, "The Yankee papers of the 6th exhibit a gloomy picture for our enemy. It does seem as though God was with us right now." The colonel was right to think that the Confederacy was nearing its pinnacle. The movement is onward all along our lines. A week subsequent to Taylor's letter, the Confederate Senate enacted a resolution urging President Jefferson Davis to reinstate free trade along the Mississippi River. The idea behind this move was to confront Union voters with the prospect of war, in the hopes of convincing them to support less determined candidates. The caveat was that these operations would need to provide observable military outcomes. But even though the Confederacy had a number of victories in the summer of 1862, time was running out, forcing its military leaders to accept inevitable risks. The North was only beginning to realize its full potential, while the Southern states were enjoying the greatest odds they had encountered since the early months of the war and were getting close to their maximum manpower capacity. The South had a ratio of slightly better than 3 to 4, with 477,000 men in the field in July and August, representing 76% of the 624,000 men in the North. The fact that President Abraham Lincoln had requested an extra 300,000 three-year volunteers on July 1 was also known to the Confederate commanders. This would bring the North's total to 924,000 troops when mobilized, further tipping the odds against the South. The North would have only mobilized about 20% of its potential armed force, even with the extra volunteers. Conversely, the South had already deployed nearly double that percentage, 39.8%, of its white male population between the ages of 18 and 45. Moreover, on August 4, the Union War Department conscripted 300,000 extra men for 9 months of service from the state militias. The odds against the South would now be over 3 to 1 as a result. Confederate officials felt that the time was ripe for serious military action, even if they were unable to know that the Lincoln administration was rapidly approaching the decision to enroll African Americans as troops. The drumbeat for this kind of thing pounded quickly. On August 16, the spearhead of fellow Confederate Major Gen. Edmund Kirby Smith crossed into Kentucky as Robert E. Lee prepared to outflank Major Gen. John Pope on the Rapidan River in Virginia. Major Gen. William Loring of West Virginia sent Brigg. Gen. Albert Jenkins on a daring cavalry expedition to the Ohio River on August 22, while Lee was dancing with Pope on the Rappahannock. As Major Gen. Thomas J. on August 25. Stonewall Jackson left for Thoroughfare Gap, and Major Gens. Columns were placed by General Braxton Bragg, moving through western Tennessee with Earl Van Dorn and Sterling Price. As Jackson engaged in combat at Bronner's Farm on the 28th, Bragg departed Chattanooga for Kentucky. "Our army is in fighting trim and Bragg is anxious to strike a blow, and will surely do it," penned a surgeon serving in Bragg's army. Ultimately, on the 30th, as Major Gen. James Longstreet crushed Major Gen. Fitz John Porter's flank on the plains of Manassas, Smith marched to engage Union forces at Richmond, Kentucky. He expressed great hopes of soon drinking his horse in the Ohio. It looked like this was the closest England and France would ever get to intervening on behalf of Southern independence. The Confederate star gleamed brightly for a moment. In his capacity as the chief of major Confederate operations in the West, Bragg held the nominal command of 5 columns: his own, Smith's column, the armies of Van Dorn and Price in northern Mississippi, and a lesser force under Brigg. Gen. Humphrey Marshall in southwest Virginia. To clear the mountainous counties of western Virginia, Loring launched his own army and a different cavalry raid under Jenkins in the interim. The always aggressive Lee had written to Secretary of War George Randolph on June 19, saying, Bragg ought immediately to advance. In September 4, Bragg's close friend Davis gave him advice, saying, "You have the field before you, and I rely on your judgment." 10 days later, Randolph gave Bragg the command to strike the moment opportunity offers. Bragg was never able to exercise more than token coordination over his command because he was too busy concentrating on Major Gen. Don Carlos Buell's Union force, which had left Corinth, Mississippi, and was moving eastward to Chattanooga, Tennessee. The three armies of Bragg, Smith, and Marshall never physically unified, not even in Kentucky. As a result, the massive Confederate attack was a tangle of almost random architecture, held together by the thinnest of threads. The strategy called for Smith's 18,000-man force and Bragg's 35,000-man army to coordinate their movements against Buell in Middle Tennessee in order to pin him down. Once he was destroyed, they would move into Kentucky with the armies of Marshall and Loring in western Virginia providing cover on their right flank. Smith would destroy a minor Union garrison holding Cumberland Gap on the Tennessee-Kentucky boundary as Bragg advanced north through Tennessee and into central Kentucky. Davis wrote to Kirby Smith, "I trust that the junction with Bragg, if effected in time, will enable the two armies to crush Buell's column and advance to the recovery of Tennessee and the occupation of Kentucky." Kirby Smith, for his part, consented to work with Bragg. "A spectacular summer campaign is still possible," he reassured the other general. "Regretfully for the South, there would be no cohesive movement. Instead, I will gladly subordinate my command to you, subject to your orders." Smith's audacity and self-reliance, along with Bragg's customary hesitancy and cowardice, undermined the strategy from the beginning. In actuality, neither was in charge of the invasion. John Hunt Morgan, the head of the Kentucky cavalry and a native of the state, claimed that secessionist sentiment was rife in central Kentucky, which heightened enthusiasm for the campaign. Morgan declared, "I have enough force here to hold the nation outside of Lexington and Frankfort. Home guards are the main garrison in these areas. There is no longer any ridge between Lexington and Cincinnati." Captured by Kentucky fever, as he phrased it, Smith offered a different plan. "March straight on Lexington. The entire country can be secured, and 25,000 to 30,000 men will join you at once." The initial plan that he and Bragg had agreed upon was dramatically altered, if not undermined, by the idea. Remarkably, Bragg, who had the opportunity to stop him at the outset, cheerfully gave in. The campaign that followed would go on to become one of the war's most egregious illustrations of what happens when there is a lack of unity in command and a vague military goal. On August 14, the Confederates marched into Kentucky with little resistance. They had left Knoxville. "And now we have crossed Tennessee and have advanced 50 miles into Kentucky without firing a gun at Yankees." A foot soldier wrote in his journal, "I certainly thought we would run into Buell and fight a bloody battle before heading out of Tennessee, but that gentleman seems to have taken off and left the nation twice as quickly." Smith's army chose to go around the Union garrison at Cumberland Gap, making its way through mountain gaps to the west of the stronghold. Contrary to Morgan's boasts, the locals saw secessionists with hatred when the Confederate force descended more into the bluegrass state and discovered it to be in the midst of a terrible 3-month drought, and the area as poor as Job's turkey. The reply a Kentuckian sitting on a porch gave one of Smith's men was indicative of their mindset. "Where is this route leading?" the cavalryman asked. He was told, "Don't go nowhere. Damn it, it stays right here." The coming of the Confederates did not cheer up many Kentuckians. They were dubbed ragged, greasy, and dirty, and some barefoot, and looked more like the bipeds of pandemonium than beings of this earth by an inhospitable citizen. The Confederate commander described it plainly in a letter to his wife. They surrounded our wells like the locusts of Egypt, and struggled with each other as if perishing with thirst. And they thronged our kitchen doors and windows, begging for bread like hungry wolves. Smith stated, "The people are vehemently and violently opposed to us." Smith has 4 divisions under him. Out of them, 3 were led by Brigg. Gens. Each of the 3 men, Harry Heth, Patrick R. Cleburne, and Thomas J. Churchill, numbered roughly 3,000. Under Brigg. Gen. Carter L. Stevenson, the remaining army, 9,000 soldiers, was grouped into one sizable division. This number was comparable to the size of the Union garrison at Cumberland Gap. Smith left Stevenson to watch the Federals, unwilling to leave such a sizable force in his wake unattended. By August 26, Heth's division had moved closer to Stevenson in anticipation of reinforcements and the Army's wagon train, while Cleburne and Churchill's division had headed north toward Richmond and Big Hill. The march was dreadful, with ankle-deep dust on the routes that wound through nearly impenetrable mountains. With temperatures in the 90s and dry conditions, it was nearly impossible to get water. The troops had to make the most of living off the land after swiftly outpacing its supply vehicles. Nevertheless, the 2 lead divisions of the Confederacy finished the march in 3 days thanks to their strong morale. Smith's aggressive advance into central Kentucky took command of the campaign from Bragg and complicated coordination of operations. Since Smith was so far to the north of him, Bragg left Chattanooga, made a detour around Nashville, and followed the Louisville and Nashville Railroad north into Kentucky. Buell's Army of the Tennessee was forced to counterattack after being outflanked. Meanwhile, Major Gen. William Bull Nelson, a native Kentuckian with headquarters in Lexington, one of Buell's division commanders, gathered and placed under command a growing group of men almost entirely made up of green troops minus 6,500 men in 2 divisions dubbed rather grandly the Army of Kentucky. Major Gen. Horatio Wright of the Department of the Ohio thought the Kentucky River offered the most favorable terrain to set up a line to meet the advancing Confederates, so with that in mind, he ordered Nelson to Lexington. Wright had little faith in the new recruits, telling leaders in Washington, "If you say go, they go, but I shall not expect success except by chance." Nelson was urged to use the river as his first line of defense due to the strong granite bluffs that rose from the water at an acute angle of 90 degrees. Until Nelson arrived, Major Gen. Lew Wallace, the author of the biblically inspired novel Ben-Hur, was temporarily in charge of the green recruits. Wallace sent some troops and artillery to the Kentucky River and sent others south to Lancaster and Richmond because it was unclear what Smith's intended objective was. To scout the area below Richmond, towards Kingston and Big Hill, Union cavalry was dispatched. Nelson arrived in Lexington on August 24 and took Wallace's place. It didn't take long to realize he had his own opinions. Nelson was a noisy, brassy, vulgar soldier who had been in the Navy as a young man and was inconsiderate of other people's feelings and opinions. His goal was to engage Smith south of the Kentucky River and move his forces on Richmond from there. In order to threaten Smith's flank should he proceed further north, Nelson relocated some men to Lancaster and Danville, which are located west of Richmond, and maintained others in Lexington. In addition, Nelson gave the order for the artillery and 3 infantry regiments from Nicholasville to join the 5 regiments that were already in Richmond. He derided Smith as a much smaller potato than I took him for, saying his strategy was to mass the troops, knowing that the enemy would not cross the Kentucky River while 16,000 men were on their flank. Smith's cavalry screened his advance into Kentucky, dispersing multiple Union regiments in the process. They completely routed the green and terrified escort of a wagon train that was traveling from Richmond to Cumberland Gap on August 23 at Big Hill. Riding forward, the triumphant Southern troops approached Richmond and made demands for its surrender. When their demand was denied, the horsemen retired to Big Hill to await Smith, unable to press the matter further. Union cavalry, on the 25th, was deployed west and south of Big Hill on a reconnoitering mission to see if they could learn something of Smith's location and plans. They were able to report increasing Confederate forces in the Big Hill region by the evening of the 28th. Field intelligence would begin to seriously collapse after that, endangering Nelson's preparations. The report was relayed to Nelson in Richmond, but the cavalry was unaware that he had just left for Lexington. As such, he never got the information, and one may reasonably suppose that if he had known that Smith was concentrating close to Big Hill, he very likely would have brought his severely divided forces back together the following day. Nelson's Provisional Army of Kentucky was composed of 2 brigades, each led by a brigadier general, Charles Cruft and Malin Manson. In Buell's army, both men had commanded brigades in Nelson's previous division. Both men were political appointees with no military experience, and neither one had faith in his troops. When Cruft said, "It was a sad spectacle for a soldier to look at these raw levies and contemplate their fate in a trial at arms with experienced troops," he may have been speaking for all 8 regimental commanders. He also bemoaned the fact that his soldiers could but indifferently execute some of the simplest movements in the manual of arms. Since there was no telegraph line connecting Lancaster and Richmond, Nelson was unable to communicate directly with his other forces in Danville and Lancaster. Therefore, he left Manson in charge of his forces at Richmond while he was away, giving him the order to stay there rather than head west to join his intended concentration at Lancaster. Nelson made his mistake of staying below the Kentucky River more worse in this way. Nelson telegraphed to Wright the next day that Kirby Smith's game is now clear. Nelson now focused his entire force, comprising 16,000 men from the Department of the Ohio and Central Kentucky, southwest of Richmond near Lancaster. He will assail Buell in left and rear, he said. Nelson reasoned that if Smith went back toward Buell in Tennessee, he would be on his flank. Smith blocked Smith's route if he went directly up toward Kentucky's bluegrass region. The conjecture was logical and reasonable in light of the evidence at hand, yet it was incorrect. The Confederates finished a strenuous 3-day march on August 29 that tested the endurance of people. Smith described them as rough, barefoot, nearly starving, marching day and night, exhausted from want of water. "I have never witnessed such pain, and not a single grumble or complaint is heard. No army in history has ever possessed such tenacity, patriotism, and self-control. Marching through practically impassable terrain in a region devastated by drought, the Confederates advanced far into Kentucky and arrived at Big Hill, 16 miles south of Richmond. Cleburn's division was in the van, while Churchill's division was positioned on the Richmond road behind him. For the past 6 days, the cavalry had been in continual communication with the enemy, scouting well beyond the infantry and informing Smith of the forces that were assembling around Richmond, which was located deep below the Kentucky River's protective line. Smith was itching for a fight, spurred on by the belief that the opposing force of green levies was mainly ignorant of the magnitude or pace of his advance. Wrote later that if they had known his strength, they would have posied themselves along the high bluffs and precipices of the Kentucky River, where they could have resisted the passage of even a greatly superior force, or would have opposed us in the passes and strong positions of the Cumberland Mountains. Manson, who was encamped a few miles away, received a report from Union cavalry that morning that revealed the Confederate approach. The message reached him at 11 a.m. Nelson received the information after that, and in yet another stunning breakdown of field intelligence, He did not see it for almost 16 hours. Manson received a second report from Union troopers 3 hours after the first one, telling him that 4,000 to 5,000 Confederates were making a serious advance. At this point, all I had to decide was whether to let the enemy attack me in camp or to move forward to confront him, Manson said. To withdraw would be to be viewed as a coward and shamed into exile. 1.5 miles south of his position was a ridge that commanded the high ground, and Manson was afraid that if he did not take it, the Confederates would. Manson moved his brigade forward quickly to take the high ground, against Nelson's orders to stay put. Almost immediately, his guns drove off the inquisitive Confederate cavalry. In fact, Manson's van moved forward with unexpected ease and managed to take several prisoners, horses, and cannons into custody. Confederate horsemen were kept at bay by Union gunfire, and by dusk, he had moved further south along the ridge to the quiet hamlet of Rogersville. Feeling pleased about his prospects, Manson went into camp after moving forward his cavalry. Smith gave Cleburne the command to strike in the morning after he grew more and more certain that night that marching on Lexington was the right course of action. Smith came to that conclusion as a result of an armed battle that took place that evening. Manson sent his cavalry forward to reconnoiter, and shortly afterward, they came upon Confederate horsemen who were driven back to Cleburne's well-positioned defenses with great difficulty. The Union troopers, driven as hard as they had been at Big Hill, were split wide open by bursts of gunfire. The battle for the day came to an end at that point, and Manson sent word to Cruft at Richmond to prepare to march to his aid the following morning. The following morning, in the early hours of the dawn, Manson's soldiers prepared their coffee and made their way around, fumbling to locate water for their canteens. Scouts soon discovered Cleburne's division passing through Kingston Village and heading north. Manson sent Cruft orders to join him, and he promptly set up his regiment 1 mile south of Mount Zion Church, just past Rogersville. Situated around 5.5 miles below Richmond on high land overlooking the Richmond Road, the church would have the Union forces positioned on either side in a defensive line. The 69th Indiana was stationed west of the road, the 71st behind the 55th in reserve, and the 55th Indiana deployed east of it. The Union guns soon unlimbered and started raking Cleburne's column's head. In response to this devastating fire, Cleburne sent his division east of the Irving-Lancaster Pike, which stretched north of Kingston and east and west. In addition, he deployed his own artillery to the front lines, using it in a deliberate counter-battery fire and ordering it to fire slowly so as not to waste any rounds. In fact, Cleburne, who held command until Smith arrived, made a concerted effort to engage the enemy by advancing his division into a line that reached past the eastern flank of the Federals. Kirby Smith instructed Cleburne to hold off on his audacious flank attack and to wait for Churchill's brigades to arrive before moving on Manson's stronghold. Once in place, Cleburne moved east of the road into the Union center, while one of Churchill's regiments struck Manson's right flank. Colonel Preston Smith's brigade would be kept in reserve to take advantage of any breakthrough, or, in the event that Manson feared it most, slip off to the east and strike his left flank. He would make a string of disastrous errors in judgment as a result of that anxiety. In the middle of the ferocious artillery engagement came the 16th Indiana, the last of Manson's 4 regiments. Positioned between the 55th and 69th Indiana regiments, the 16th was placed front and center. The Union left flank had effectively been extended past Cleburne's right. A fairly lively exchange of small arms fire broke out just after 10 a.m. as Colonel Thomas McRae's leading brigade of Churchill's division started to arrive in the woods east of the Richmond Road. Kirby Smith and Cleburne were persuaded by the skirmish that Manson intended to shift the Confederate right. In retaliation, Cleburne extended Hill's line eastward by moving the 154th Tennessee, the regiment positioned at the far right of Preston Smith's reserve line. Manson continued to believe that his left flank posed the real threat as McCrae's brigade moved into the area behind Mount Zion Church in preparation for their push on the Union right flank. In response, he sent 7 companies of the 69th Indiana, which had been deployed on the right flank, and his reserve regiment, the 71st Indiana, to support his left. The 69th was reduced to just 3 companies on the right, ready to attack McCrae's brigade. East of Richmond Road, a fierce combat broke out along the entire front of Manson's line as the 69th, 16th, and 55th Indiana battalions pressed to within 100 yards of the Confederate position. Consequently, Cleburne reacted swiftly, sending Colonel Lucius Polk's 13th and 15th Arkansas regiments to assist the 154th Tennessee on the eastern side. Polk's soldiers would be at a 90-degree angle to the end of Manson's line after they had advanced far enough into the woods. The enemy had staked everything on driving back or turning our right flank, and that they had weakened their center to effect this object, Cleburne realized. Still uninformed of McCrae's imminent onslaught, Manson, by overloading his left, had prompted the response he feared the most, an attack against that area of his front. Furthermore, a trick of the terrain prompted him to make a series of tactical blunders. He was positioned in the middle of the Union line, behind the 55th Indiana, and could not have noticed McCrae's column coming toward his right flank. A valley cut beyond his right flank to the north, and a stream called Hayes Fork ran less than a quarter of a mile west. He was oblivious to all of these features. A mile beyond the creek lay a large cornfield. With caution, the Confederates moved through a ravine and a cornfield before unleashing a force comparable to a thunderbolt on the few Union soldiers who were blind to their approach. Preston Smith's brigade skillfully carried out Cleburne's orders as McCrae struck the right at the church, making a 90-degree angle to Manson's left and achieving a lethal enfilade from which they unloosed enormous volleys. The raw Federals disintegrated fast and devolved into near-chaotic behavior. Concurrently, Cleburne was getting ready to personally lead Hill's brigade directly in the direction of Manson's center. By then, Cleburne didn't really need to talk, but as he rode over, he stopped to speak with Polk, who had been hurt. He was hit by a ball that passed through his open mouth and knocked out 4 teeth, depriving him of the powers of speech, and this rendered my further presence on the field worse than useless. His earlier tactical dispositions had set in motion a bold design for triumph, an early hint of the skills that would make Cleburne one of the Confederacy's top fighting generals, even in spite of the wound and his subsequent absence from the field. Since the enemy was strengthening its eastern flank as a result of his maneuvers, which had placed a large portion of his division in an extended line beyond it, he made preparations to launch a swift attack in the precise location where Union men were being withdrew. Leaving its camp at Richmond, Cruft's brigade marched at double rapid speed into the field, with the 95th Ohio in the vanguard, into a terrible situation. The 95th's commander, Colonel William McMillan, was told to place the regiment on the right flank, supporting 3 companies from the 69th Indiana, and to rapidly charge an unlimbering Southern battery in order to aid McCrae's push against Mount Zion Church. McMillan ought to have questioned the order, and it never should have been granted. The dispersed regiment would have to go directly ahead of McCrae's forces, who were then pouring out of the ravine and toward the church with no time to deploy. The Ohioans were brutalized by the Confederates. According to McMillan, the enemy advanced his right and left wings, outflanking and driving our forces before him while we were thus engaged. Seeing that it would be reckless and useless to continue our assault upon the battery, I ordered the regiment to halt and fall back, which they did, for a time, in good order, losing, however, in addition to our killed and wounded, 160 men and a large number of officers at this point. Lieutenant Colonel J.B. Armstrong, who assumed command when McMillan inexplicably left the field, had a different version. According to Armstrong, McMillan's real directive was for every man to save himself, starting with himself. Armstrong put the number of men captured at 200. Next was the 18th Kentucky, forming a line behind which the bloodied 95th and Manson's fragmented battalions could rejoin. As Manson tersely described, the rout had become general. The 18th courageously turned back the relentless Confederate advance. However, the unit retired with heavy casualties after a short while. Cruft agreed that the panic was well nigh universal, but praised the 18th for keeping the withdrawal from turning into a rout. The situation was quickly taking on a disgraceful aspect. Cruft's brigade left the 12th and 66th Indiana, who were withdrawn 2 miles behind the initial combat line in an effort to rally the remaining command. Manson's broken battalions gathered east of the Richmond Road, not far from where Manson's infantry had beaten off Confederate cavalry the previous day. Cruft pieced together a new line west of the road. A messenger from Lexington arrived and sent Manson an order from Nelson, which should have been issued 2 or 3 days earlier, while Manson and Cruft were seeing the Confederates assembling to advance on the new line. It told Manson to march west to Lancaster rather than engage in combat at Richmond. In reaction to the cavalry report from the day before, Nelson had sent the order 10 hours earlier, at 2:30 a.m. In a matter of minutes, the self-assured rebels moved into McCrae's column with the intention of winning the fight. Preston Smith led the charge toward Cruft's location and advanced on Manson's. A Union battery of 6 guns belched canister when they got within 400 yards, and musketry volleys quickly followed. McCrae described it as the most incessant firing of cannon and musketry I have ever heard. Cruft's forces battled with incredible tenacity to thwart the Confederate attack. Still, the butternuts kept moving forward, coming up against a densely overgrown fence roughly 200 yards from Cruft's line. When McCrae noticed that canister and many balls were swarming the air, he gave the order for his soldiers to take shelter. Emboldened by their defense, and perhaps thinking the tide had switched to them, the Union forces counterattacked. McCrae ordered them to rise and shoot once they were within 50 yards. The Federals were driven back in the wildest confusion and disorder by a terrible rain of bullets that buzzed through the air like angry insects, destroying soldiers with fearsome effect. Confederates up and down the line persistently pressed forward, with both Union battalions melting away before them. After the second Union combat position was breached, Manson and Cruft resolved to make another stand at the city cemetery in Richmond's southern suburbs while they worked feverishly to restore and preserve unit cohesiveness. The Army's commanding general arrived and was greeted with unexpected cheering while the new post was being organized. As the furious Nelson tried to reestablish order by striking soldiers over the head with the flat surfaces of his sword, no doubt those who had applauded him later regretted it. Following their encounter on the field, Nelson and Manson exchanged words, and Nelson later accused Manson of defying his orders to avoid a conflict and move the army to Lancaster. Now, behind a stone gate and the cemetery's tombstones, Nelson, Manson, and Cruft rallied 2,500 soldiers to the top of a low-lying ridge. Kirby Smith allowed his exhausted Confederates to recuperate for approximately 60 minutes. By that point, the battle had lasted 8 hours in the sweltering sun and had spanned miles of territory. When reformed, the plan of attack would go forward unchanged, strike the flanks, with Churchill pushing on the left and Preston Smith on the right. On the edge of a total triumph, Kirby Smith added a new wrinkle, sending his cavalry on a sweep around Richmond to cut off the predicted Union retreat. He issued a general advance order at 5:00 p.m. Union artillery opened first, firing shells and then canister at the disciplined Confederates. Compared to earlier in the day, the soldiers who were waiting for Smith's men were not quite as green. They'd learned a lot about fighting from the 2 spanks they'd received, and now they were dealing a deadly blow and taking a terrible price. As we quickly formed our lines and moved on the cemetery, 140 men of the 2nd Tennessee and 128 of the 48th Tennessee were killed and wounded in 20 minutes, a Southerner recalled. As the sun began to set, the sulphurous smoke covered the sky, giving it a blood-red color. Nelson rode among the soldiers, trying to motivate them and threatening to harm them if they did not perform their duties. He yelled, "Boys, if they can't hit something as big as I am, they can't hit anything," while pointing to his enormous girth. His personal pleadings were successful, and the Union line briefly held. But another lethal volley tore through the Union lines in a matter of seconds, and those who were not killed or injured fled behind. Following the panic-stricken mob that had been the Union Army's retreat through the streets of Richmond and onto the Lexington road, the troops stood about 3 rounds. When struck by panic, they fled in disorder, as Nelson, who had been struck by a pair of balls that smashed into his thigh, later observed, their cavalry under Kirby Smith was waiting for them. Hundreds of men were shot down by his troopers before they capitulated. Nelson slipped away by hiding in a cornfield. A Confederate major said that the havoc was frightful, and the Federals threw down their arms and surrendered in crowds, and of the few who escaped not 1 in 10 carried his musket with him. The cavalry commander claimed that he had a 10-acre lot full. Unable to provide Smith with a precise estimate due to the large number of detainees. Although the size of the fighting in the Battle of Richmond was not quite as great as that of the ancient Battle of Cannae, the strategies and overall lopsided nature of the conflict bore striking similarities to that previous conflict. The Union suffered a loss of 206 dead, 844 wounded, and 4,304 missing. Only about 800 to 900 people were able to escape. There were 98 dead, 492 wounded, and 8 missing for the Confederacy. After pushing through to take over Lexington on September 2, Kirby Smith contacted his wife, saying, "I'm doing well and getting the best welcome in Kentucky. People are coming out in large numbers. Thousands of recruits are coming to me in droves." The South was engulfed in a feverish enthusiasm that stretched from Kentucky to the Ohio. The Richmond Dispatch declared, "We think we can safely say that Kentucky's day of deliverance from the hateful thrall of abolition despotism has brightly dawned." The Confederates did certainly have a plethora of military options at their disposal, but it remained to be seen if they would benefit from them.